Every single empire that has ever existed believed it was unstoppable. The Romans called themselves eternal. Napoleon called his army the greatest fighting force the world had ever seen. The United States, at the height of its power, spent more on its military than the next 10 countries combined. And yet, the Romans fell. Napoleon was exiled to an island. America has called for ceasefires it never expected to need. So why does this keep happening? Why does the most powerful military in the room always eventually hit a wall? Today, we're going to find out. Here's the uncomfortable truth that military strategists know, but governments rarely admit. No military, no matter how advanced, how funded, or how feared, is truly invincible. Not because they lack weapons, not because their soldiers aren't brave, but because war is never just about weapons. It's about logistics, willpower, geography, time, and the will of the people you're fighting. Today, we'll look at 4 reasons for why every military carries the seeds of its own vulnerability. Let's start with the oldest military killer in history: overextension. The year is 1812. Napoleon Bonaparte commands the Grande Armée, 600,000 soldiers, the largest army Europe has ever seen. He has conquered most of the continent. He is, by every measure, unstoppable. Then, he marches into Russia. What Napoleon found wasn't just an enemy army. He found distance. He found winter. He found a Russian strategy of deliberate retreat, burning crops, emptying villages, leaving nothing for his army to eat. By the time he reached Moscow, the city was in flames. His supply lines stretched thousands of miles. His men were starving and freezing. Of the 600,000 soldiers who crossed into Russia, fewer than 100,000 made it back. Not because Russia had better weapons, but because Napoleon's army was simply too far from home. And this wasn't a one-time lesson. The United States made a similar mistake in Afghanistan, a 20-year war that cost over $2 trillion. Supply chains stretched across the globe, bases in landlocked mountains. Every bullet, every meal, every drop of fuel had to be flown in. When the US withdrew in 2021, the Afghan government collapsed in 11 days. The lesson? A military that cannot sustain itself cannot win. Strength at headquarters means nothing if you can't project it to the battlefield. But what happens when the enemy doesn't fight back the way you expect? This is the second great weakness of powerful militaries, the problem of asymmetric warfare. Vietnam, 1965. The United States military is the most technologically advanced fighting force the world has ever seen. It has jets, helicopters, napalm, and Agent Orange. The North Vietnamese have rifles, bicycles, and tunnels. And yet, the United States lost. Not on the battlefield. They won almost every major military engagement. But the Viet Cong didn't need to win battles. They needed to survive them. They melted into jungles. They booby-trapped trails. They fought a war of exhaustion, making the cost of staying too high for America to bear. Back home, American families watched body bags coming off planes every night on television. Public support collapsed. Politicians buckled. And the most powerful military in the world withdrew. Not because it was defeated in combat, but because the will to fight ran out. The same story played out for the Soviet Union in Afghanistan in the 1980s. The Mujahideen, armed with basic weapons and funded by the US, fought the Red Army to a standstill for 9 years. The USSR withdrew in 1989 and collapsed 2 years later. Powerful militaries are built to fight other powerful militaries.
They are not built to fight shadows. When your enemy has nothing to lose, they become almost impossible to destroy.
The third vulnerability is one that every military eventually faces. The enemy adapts. At the start of World War I, military commanders were still thinking in the language of the Napoleonic era. Cavalry charges, open field battles, decisive engagements. What they got instead was the machine gun. Suddenly, any soldier who walked across an open field was dead. Hundreds of thousands of men were sent over the top of trenches in charges that accomplished nothing except filling graveyards. The greatest armies in Europe, Britain, France, Germany, were paralyzed. They had the most powerful militaries in the world, and they were completely stumped by a new technology they hadn't planned for. This pattern repeats constantly. The tank made cavalry obsolete. The aircraft carrier made the battleship obsolete. The missile made the aircraft carrier vulnerable. And today, the drone is rewriting the rules again. In the 2020 war in Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan used cheap Turkish-made drones to destroy Armenia's Russian-supplied tanks and artillery. Billion-dollar equipment taken out by machines that cost a fraction of the price. Here's the brutal irony. The more you invest in yesterday's technology, the more vulnerable you become to tomorrow's. The most expensive military in the world is only as powerful as its ability to adapt. And history shows adaptation is always one step behind innovation.
Now, let's talk about something happening right now. A conflict that is actively demonstrating, in real time, why military power alone is not enough to win a war. In June 2025, the United States and Israel launched major strikes on Iran, targeting nuclear sites, assassinating top military and political leaders, and attempting to neutralize Iran's military infrastructure in what was called the 12-Day War. By almost every conventional measure, the operation was a military success. Iran's nuclear facilities were severely damaged. Its top commanders were eliminated. Its air defenses were degraded. America had done what it set out to do militarily. And yet, the war didn't end there. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical shipping lanes in the world, through which roughly 20% of global oil passes. Iranian missile strikes continued. Proxy forces across the region activated. The economic and diplomatic pressure mounted not just on Iran, but on the United States itself. By April 2026, the US, the same superpower that had just conducted one of the most sophisticated military campaigns in modern history, was calling for a ceasefire. Not once, but repeatedly. Trump extended the ceasefire, then extended it again. Talks were held in Islamabad. They produced no agreement. The strait remained closed. The blockade continued. The war ground on. Meanwhile, Iran, a country whose top leaders had been assassinated, whose nuclear sites had been bombed, whose economy was under crippling sanctions, was still at the table, still negotiating on its own terms, still issuing counterproposals, still refusing to surrender. Iran's parliament speaker said it plainly: Iran will not give in to surrender terms. Think about what this reveals. The United States spent trillions building the most powerful military on Earth. It conducted a near-flawless military operation, and it still couldn't translate that military victory into a political one. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow stretch of water, proved to be a strategic equalizer that no amount of air power could immediately solve. This is the fourth great truth about military power. Winning the war is not the same as winning the peace. You can destroy an enemy's weapons. You cannot easily destroy their geography, their resolve, or their leverage over global systems. Now, at this point, some of you might be thinking, okay, but what about nuclear weapons? Surely a country with thousands of nuclear warheads is effectively invincible. And it's a fair question. Nuclear weapons are, without question, the greatest deterrent ever invented. No nuclear-armed state has ever been invaded by another nuclear power. Mutually assured destruction, the doctrine that launching a nuclear attack guarantees your own annihilation, has kept the world's great powers from direct conflict for 80 years. But here's the problem. Nuclear weapons are useless against most of the threats we've talked about today. You can't nuke a guerrilla fighter hiding in a jungle. You can't nuke a drone swarm. You can't nuke a supply line problem. You can't nuke a closed strait. And you absolutely cannot nuke your way to a peace agreement. Nuclear weapons prevent the biggest war. They do almost nothing to win the smaller ones, and it's the smaller ones that keep happening. The United States has had nuclear weapons since 1945. It has also lost in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, and struggled to conclude the conflict in Iran. Invincibility requires winning all wars. Nuclear weapons only prevent one specific kind.
So let's zoom out. Every military in history that believed itself invincible shared the same blind spot. They confused strength with invulnerability. They could count their tanks, their jets, their soldiers. What they couldn't count was the enemy's patience, the terrain, the political will at home, the diplomatic cost abroad, the price of a closed shipping lane, the cost of a decade-long occupation. War is not just a military problem. It is a political problem, an economic problem, a geographic problem, a human problem. And no military, no matter how powerful, gets to opt out of those realities. The Romans learned it. Napoleon learned it. The Soviet Union learned it. The United States has learned it, more than once. History doesn't record invincible militaries. It records ones that lasted longer than others, until they didn't. So the next time a government calls its military unstoppable, the next time a leader declares total victory before the war is actually over, remember this. Every army that ever marched into history carrying the banner of invincibility left it somewhere on the road home. The question was never whether they could be stopped. The question was always by what and when. If you found this video thought-provoking, consider subscribing. We cover the hidden forces behind wars, empires, and the moments that shaped our world. And let us know in the comments, which military defeat surprised you the most? See you in the next one.